This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. Folks, we're very fortunate today and tonight to have as our guest one of my favorite, I don't know him that well, but one of the most famous guests I've ever had on my show, for doing this show for close to 15 years, Dr. Wayne Flynt, the renowned historian of Alabama and professor emeritus at Auburn University for 28 years and 12 years before that at Sanford, and as the author of many books. And we're so glad to have him be with us today. He's got a book out that is going to be memorable and cherished by not just Alabamians, but throughout the country, called Afternoons with Harper Lee. Dr. Flynt, good to have you on the show.
Thank you, Steve. I'm looking forward to this.
I don't usually do this, but he's got so many accolades. I want to just read y'all some of his just tell you how famous and noteworthy and accomplished he is. Apologize for reading, but there's so much stuff. He's a Southern historian and educator who retired after teaching for decades at Auburn University, where he directed more than 60 graduate programs. Dr. Flynt has lectured in China at Queen's University, Belfast, Northern Ireland at the Universities of Newcastle, Oxford, Cambridge, Sussex, and Great Britain, and at the Franklin Roosevelt Center in the Netherlands at the University of Vienna. He is the author of 14 books dealing with Southern politics, history, white poverty, and culture. His numerous awards include the Rembrandt Patrick Award for Florida History, the Lillian Smith Prize for Nonfiction, and the Van Woodward Franklin Prize for Fellowship of Southern Writers. Folks, he's a legend, and we're so glad to have him. But the reason we wanted to have him on is he's got a book he spent some time on, and about Harper Lee, Afternoons with Harper Lee, who is probably the most renowned Southern writer of our lifetime because of the book To Kill a Mockingbird. And Dr. Flynt, you know, it was just such a perfect poetic timing that you'd have this chance to meet with her and get to know her, and you tell an inside story of Harper Lee, who everybody in Monroe calls Nell Harper Lee, and she knew you knew her if you called her Nell. But it's such a remarkable inside story, not just of her life, but her genealogy. And you intertwined it with your knowledge of Alabama history, and you brought in the history of Alabama, the background of different regions of the state, and different cultures. And you met her, and you used this term, and I think people like to use it, those of us who write about politics and Southern history, is a big front porch. Alabama's a big front porch. Hadn't you noticed it all your life?
It was part of my growing up years. I was pre-air conditioning for early part of my life, and it was a working class family. My dad never finished college.
I mean, you had a bunch of siblings too, didn't you?
I did, and of course, what I first remember as a child is sitting transfixed while my grandfather, who learned only to read and write toward the end of his life, he was a sharecropper and he couldn't even read and write.
In Calhoun County, was it?
Yes, Calhoun County.
Outside of Anniston, or close?
Right outside of Anniston, 10 miles or so. Mm-hmm. But he was the greatest storyteller I have ever heard in my life.
Your grandfather.
I don't ever expect to hear anybody as great a storyteller. And see, when you think about it, if you don't read and you don't write, you remember, you contain things that you and I could never in 1,000 years remember all the details and the punchline and exactly how you set it up. Uh-huh. He was just absolutely great. And so
he was your paternal grandfather?
He was my paternal grandfather. Uh-huh. And I never forgot that in Alabama, storytelling is the best way to communicate profound truth. Not abstraction, not theory, just tell a story. And watch the person listening to that story process it, and deconstruct it. And that was the way the entire Lee family was. And of course, To Kill a Mockingbird is not only the greatest story, in my opinion, that anybody in Alabama's ever told, but there was a poll done by the Wall Street Journal Book Review, the New York Times Book Review section, all last year, and on December 19th, they published the result. The question was, since they had been around for 125 years, they said, we want the readers of the New York Times Book Review section to tell us their favorite novel published, or favorite book published in the last 125 years. And there were responses from 67 countries from people who were writing in. And by a landslide, To Kill a Mockingbird was voted globally, not just in America, but globally, as the favorite book of the last 125 years. So when people start talking about Alabama and putting it down, I just sort of say, well, if you knew a little bit more, maybe you wouldn't feel that way.
What about, it's also the most bought book. I know the Bible's first, but where does it rank? It's like it's in the top 5 books ever sold, isn't
Well, it does over recent years. And not only that, but in Great Britain, it actually beat the Bible. It was ahead of the Bible, which tells you a lot about the secularism of Britain. And when I told Nell that, she looked down at her feet and she said, that's not really good news.
So you called her Nell like everybody
Yeah,
else did.
well,
Monroeville people called her Nell.
Monroeville people and her nephews, and she was the one that insisted into the friendship of ways. She said, stop calling me Harper. And I said, well, my older son has named his daughter Harper
After
in
that.
your honor. And I said, that's going to be hard for me. She said, well, I'm flattered, but call me Nell.
So you were a big fan of the book and her before getting to know her.
Oh, yeah.
So that was your favorite novel and everything, and you loved the history of it.
I'll tell you a story, Steve. I was in grad school, and the 16th Street Baptist Church had just been bombed. And Darty, my wife, was teaching middle school in Tallahassee. And we watched the TV set that day, and we shed lots of tears. And then when it was over, I remember telling my wife, and this is one of the reasons husbands should never tell their wives something like it's set in concrete, because they might change their mind. I said, Darty, I don't know where we'll go next year when I get my PhD, but we will never go back to Alabama.
And both of y'all were from?
Both of us were from Alabama, and we both vowed we would never come back. And then within a series of weeks, Darty brought this book home and read it. And she said, Wayne, I want you to read this book.
To Kill a Mockingbird.
To Kill a Mockingbird.
Had it become real popular? It was
Oh, yeah. It already won the Pulitzer Prize. And that was partly why she bought it. An Alabama woman from where we were from had won a Pulitzer. But Darty said, read this. And I read the book, sometimes in tears. And she said, you know, maybe we ought to think about going back. And about that time, Samford offered me a professorship, and we came back to Alabama.
And you'd done your undergraduate, and y'all had met there.
Yes, that's correct. We met at
Old Howard.
Old Howard. And literally.
Was it still back in the old East Birmingham?
No, they moved,
it moved out to
Right,
Homewood.
right. But we literally decided to come back to Alabama.
Because of that book.
Because of that book. And when I told that to Nell, deep in our friendship, not long before she died, she just said that you would come back to Alabama based on one book is one of the most wonderful tributes that has ever been played to my book. And I said, Nell, it's just not me. There are a lot of people who came back to Alabama.
You know, you hit this in your book a lot, and I think you captured it properly. She never really thought that her book was great. She never thought, it wasn't in an humble way. She just, all like you said in the book, I just wrote a book.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, Dr. Flynt, you know, my observation of that book has always been that she just wrote a story about her childhood.
You're exactly right.
Totally an allegory.
Exactly right.
I've written in this column about 19 years now. My column in the Monroe Journal has been in there 19 years, and adjacent to my column was an old guy who was a historian of Monroeville. He wrote Monroeville history. And I got to talking to him on the phone. He was Nell's contemporary. They graduated together, and he was a Monroeville historian. He said that book was totally, they knew every character. They knew who Boo Radley was. So in her mind, all she did was write it was just the Times.
That's right.
It was the Times. You agree with me about that?
That's true, Steve. It was the Times, and also the genius of small town Southern life, where you do get to know everybody. You know, there's the alcoholic. There's the guy who gambles. There are the guys who run around on their wives.
Everybody knows it.
Everybody knows who they are. Everybody knows.
Well, they love him because he's their person.
But the characters, their characters. And what Nell did is she had all these characters from Monroeville, and she wrote a book about those characters. And then she had something that was really, really special. She had a great editor, and because I know what it's like to write a book and then have an editor. In my case, Randall Williams, who was a wonderful editor for this book. And Randall said, well, you know, think about it this way and think about it that way. And he's like a traffic cop, but kind, sort of directing you over this direction. And sometimes I would agree with him, sometimes he would agree with me. But she had a wonderful editor, Tay Hohoff at Lippincott Books. And Randall carried me from the draft I sent him to the book in probably 18 months. But she was years, revising.
Lived in New York?
Lived in New York City, and Tay Hohoff there. And she would give a new draft to Tay Hohoff and said, you know, something about this bothers me, this paragraph. Let's talk about this. And she'd talk about it, and Nell would revise it. Then she'd bring back, she said, this is a lot better. But there's still something there that bothers me a little bit. And so, to some degree, every book is the creation of the writer, the author, who gets, of course, full credit for it. And then the editor, and sometimes the readers, because they'll send it out to readers. And readers, in my case, I sent it to 15 close friends of Harper Lee. Kathy Randall at the University of Alabama, lawyer Susan Doss in Birmingham, Hank Connor, the oldest of her nephews, Ed Connor, a middle nephew, and a PhD from Vanderbilt in literature who taught great books at Kentucky State University for his whole career. Well, when you get
after Randall had edited or before?
Oh no, I had, quote, finished it.
Okay.
Sent it to them, and they said, you know, Ed Connor, who was a wonderful critic, who loves the book, thank the good Lord, but he corrected all sorts of things.
Did he correct
family?
it?
Oh yeah.
The 15 you
family
said
stories.
Prior to Randall doing his editing.
Right. Prior to Randall doing, actually even seeing the book, and so Paul Dewey, the son of Alvin and Marie Dewey, he was the head of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation.
In Cold Blood.
For In Cold Blood and Truman Capote. And no one ever has contacted him about Nell. And he was 9 years old, and the stories he tells, Steve, are just wonderful. He said, I was 9 years old, and he was strange and from New York City, and Nell was sweet from New York City. I liked her, and I didn't much, you know, I didn't know about him.
Nobody liked Capote, I don't think.
And he said, what Nell did was realize that Truman wanted to talk to my daddy. He didn't want to talk to my mother, even though she was from New Orleans and he was from New Orleans. He wanted to talk to my daddy. And he said the idea was that Nell get me out of the room. And so she started playing this tickle game.
Who, Nell did?
Nell did. And I said, now this is not your image of Nell Harper Lee, because she didn't feel real comfortable around little children, including my grandchildren. But she would grab him right under the ribs, and she'd start tickling him, which is, I'm sure, a game that she had learned in childhood growing up in Monroeville, Alabama. She'd grab him like this, and she'd start tickling. He'd start squealing and run into another room. And she'd get him trapped in that other room, and she'd tickle him, and he'd giggle until the interview was over. And then she let him go and go home. But I mean, what a wonderful story that is. And if I had not written Paul Dewey, I would have never gotten that story. Also, Paul Dewey said, Wayne, you write this as if they met in Garden City, Kansas, and then they never were with my mother and dad again. They became the very closest friends. When Truman Capote died, they flew to be with Nell in New York at the funeral. They would go to Colorado on vacations together. And he said, Harper, Nell, and my mother and dad were friends as long as the three of them lived.
Dr. Flynt, in the book, you clarify something I'd always assumed that Truman Capote was her distant cousin, but he was not a cousin, was he?
No.
The mother just left Truman in Monroeville, but
Correct.
Truman is Deal in the book,
Yes, you're right, Steve.
But he was not kin to her.
No, he was related to a family that lived next door to them, next door to Harper. There was a rock wall about 4 feet high, still there.
Book, yeah.
It's about the only thing there now. But just go across that rock wall, which any 10-year-old can do, crawl across that wall. And of course, then they made the sort of platform in the China berry tree that is famous in the movies and the stories. And the main part of that story was that she was always kind of a little ruffian.
Yeah.
She would play.
She was scout.
Oh yeah, she was scout. And she talks about I don't tell the story in the book, but she said one day, she said, Wayne, when I was little, I just loved physical contact. I didn't much like sissy kind of things. And she said one day we were playing touch football out on the grounds of the old courthouse, and she said this boy came running toward me. And she said, I just knocked him down. And he got up, kind of crying, and he said, now we're playing touch. And she said, you may be playing touch, but that's a sissy game. I only play tackle.
You captured so many inside stories about her and her life and everything, and she shared so much with you. I didn't realize she had spent all of her adult life in her apartment in New York. In her place in New York. Did she ever come? I always assumed or thought, or was told, that she and Alice lived together.
No.
They didn't live together.
Well, it's easy to understand what happened, Steve. After she became famous, she would come back for Thanksgiving, and she would usually stay until Christmas. And that's when she was with her dad. Her mom was gone by then. That's where she saw Louise Connor, her sister, because Louise would come back from Eufaula, or she would go to Eufaula and spend time with them. So she had a block of time that was basically a little over a month when she would be in Monroeville. And there were sightings, after she won a Pulitzer Prize. People would say, oh, did you see Harper Lee? She was home this week, or something like that, or she was in a grocery store. But she never really lived there.
You give credence to how great a lady Alice, her older sister, was too, who lived to be over 100, practiced law to over 100. Some people say she was the first female lawyer, but she was a prominent lawyer her entire life and practiced after 100. You capture her well in the book and give her due respect.
Yeah, I loved her. She was the grandest Southern lady I believe I've ever known, and undoubtedly the smartest person I have ever known. Steve, when she was 100, she was visiting Nell in the assisted living. And when she drove up, and she had an unusual speech pattern, which was a result of some physical problems she had. And she said, I knew you were here because I saw your 43 tag.
I'll leak at it.
And I said, never lived in Lee County. How do you know 43 is Lee County and you knew it was us? She said, I have insomnia, and when I can't sleep, I start with Autauga County, and I'm asleep by the time I get to Winston County. And I'm thinking, she knows all 67 county prefixes. I would challenge anybody who hears this today
to do that,
to recite the counties in alphabetical order, and she does that at 100.
You know, you talk about Autauga County being the 4 and everything, the first one alphabetically after Jefferson, Mobile, and Montgomery. But you captured in one of the chapters how many real famous people she got to know who wanted to befriend her because of her fame and everything. And you talk about Lady Bird Johnson, who had roots in Autauga County. Right. When you talk about that and how Lady Bird was so involved with Lyndon, and how she became friends with President Obama and other ones. And also you give a lot of respect to Gregory Peck. She really thought he was a good man.
She thought he was one of the best men she'd ever known. Also Horton Foote, who was from Horton, Texas. But she really had a special place for Lady Bird. And when I asked her, who's your favorite president? She hesitated for a minute. And she said, well, I guess it was Lady Bird and Lyndon Johnson. And of course, one of the things I say in the book is that actually Lady Bird referred to it as our presidency.
Yeah, I remember that.
In many ways, I think, I'm not sure it had been medically diagnosed, but her description of Lyndon was bipolar disorder, the same thing.
I'd never heard that referred to him. Her mother, but you picked up on that.
Her mother had bipolar disorder, and she said, you know, he would just sort of disappear in his grieving or in his moodiness. Exactly. And he said she did not hesitate to intervene. She intervened. I just mentioned 2 or 3 times she intervened because there just happened to be a brand new biography that was just wonderful about her. And they talk about how bright she was. And I wanted to, as you pointed out, I have 2 great strengths in this book. One is Harper Lee didn't have many intimate friends.
No.
You know, it was a handful. And most of those could not come down there regularly, but I had retired. 2, of course, 2 is associated with that is my wife, who had Parkinson's disease. And she really related because she'd had a stroke. She couldn't move about. Darty had difficulty moving about.
Darty came to all the meetings with y'all.
Exactly.
I can gather from the book.
And she was as much part of this book as
That's
I
what
was.
I can tell.
The stories she told and so forth. But the other thing she said about Lady Bird is she said she was her own woman, and she was from Autauga County, Alabama. And you know, to some degree, this book is really as much about Alabama as it is about Harper Lee, because Nell was so much a product of who we are. And a lot of people probably will say, well, she was so weird and strange. I don't care if she wrote the greatest novel in the history of the world. Why did she live in New York? I'll tell you what, she loved this state, but she didn't want to live in this state.
She came home and died, though.
She came home, and when she had a stroke, she stayed in Monroeville.
That's what surprised me. You think with the medical care the way it is in New York, if you spend her adult life, she comes back staying in really a modest assisted living place. I mean, she could have gone to one of the most exclusive. They're exclusive assisted living places in Birmingham.
It was very simple, extremely
That's
simple.
what
It was really
I
nice.
found that real strange.
The staff was wonderful. Well, she already had picked out a gravesite in one of the 2 really famous cemeteries in New York City, and so she thought she had life figured out. And you know, Steve, we never have life in front of us figured out.
No.
Life in front of us will do what it wants. And she thought that she would never go back to Alabama. She would certainly not be buried here.
So she was going to be buried in New York.
She was going to be buried in New York City.
Well, that is so strange that 81 years old, she has a stroke, comes back to Monroeville, and I know I'm repeating myself, but she could have picked a exclusive assisted living place in New York and had physicians around the clock and that sort of thing. But she goes to a modest place in Monroeville.
And that's partly due to Miss Alice being there.
Alice was probably the reason.
And Miss Alice knows everybody. She knew that Nell would get the best care possible there, the most attention. And to Nell's everlasting credit, she knew she was not going to have her sister very long. And that the years they had left would not be years where she could fly down on Thanksgiving instead of Christmas. If she's going back to assisted living in New York, she's not flying on a plane, because she wouldn't fly on planes. She had motion sickness.
So that's why you refer to her going the train ride.
Exactly.
She had motion sickness,
Exactly.
is the reason she would not fly.
Exactly.
Had she had that all of her life, or just after the stroke?
No, before the stroke. Yeah, in her whole adult life, she took trains.
That's why she probably wouldn't come home that much.
Correct. That's correct. And when she came home, she stayed. And even when she went to the Pedernales, when Lyndon Johnson would have her out to the ranch in Texas Hill Country, she wouldn't fly. She'd take a train. Well, that's a long way.
It sure is on a train ride.
Yeah.
And she would do it early on before the modern trains were done. You know, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, the bullet trains. Yeah, no, it was a long train ride, but she just got so sick. She either took, if she went overseas, she'd take a cruise ship, a steamer, and if she came here, she'd take the train.
Dr. Flynt, I tell you, I hate our time is up. I'd like to, if you can, sometime come back and finish up some more talk, because there's so much you learned about her.
I'd be glad to, Steve.
Folks, our book is Dr. Flynt's book's Afternoons with Harper Lee. He was the only person who got to know her really well. He spent 64 days, different over how many years?
9 years.
9 years. But it's a great read. And we thank y'all for watching. Hope you tune in next week. Let me ask you a favor.